Alright, so today we're going to be creating a sprite color palette switcher, like the one you're seeing currently, and let's get right into it. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new Unity project. I'm just going to name it whatever, and then make sure it's set to 2D, then hit create and wait for that to load up. Once you're in Unity, the first thing I'm going to do is go up to the package manager, and inside the package manager we want to install the lightweight render pipeline. So on top of all the 2D packages already, we also want to install the lightweight because that will allow us to use a custom renderer. Once that's done installing, I'm going to create a new folder, name it rendering, and then inside here I'm going to go to create, rendering, and then 2D renderer, and I'm just going to name that renderer 2D. And then I'm also going to create a pipeline asset, so back into create, rendering, and then pipeline asset. This will actually create two files, and you can just delete the second one, the renderer. Get rid of that. And then in the pipeline asset, assign the renderer 2D to the rendering list. And then I'm going to head up to Edit, Project Settings, and inside Graphics, set up the renderer. So that'll just let Unity know that we want to use that render pipeline. Then I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this shader. Inside here we want to create a new shader, and in the 2D renderer you have the option for a lit graph and an unlit graph. I'm just going to go with unlit for now and name it palette shader. Inside the graph editor, the first thing we want to do is set up some variables. So I'm going to create a texture 2D, and I'm going to call it sprite. And then the vital part of this is that we want to set the reference to _main text. Make sure it's spelled correctly and it's case sensitive. This will let Unity know to use the sprite renderer. And then we'll create a new texture 2D. I'm going to call it gradient texture. This will be where our palette will go. And then I'm going to create one more parameter. It's going to be a vector1, and it's going to be our gradient adjustment. And I'll explain this a bit more in a second. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is import our sprite, and we're going to use a sample texture 2D. And then from the RGBA of the sample texture 2D, we want to put it straight into a vector1. This will make it grayscale. And then from the vector1 out into a multiply, and we're going to multiply it by our gradient adjustment. So yeah, as you can see, it'll make it grayscale. Multiply that by our gradient adjustment. And then we're going to go ahead and grab our gradient texture, and then connect that up to a sample texture 2D. And then connect the multiply. Just move this over a bit. Yeah, so we're going to be modifying the UVs, and that is usually in a vector2. So we're going to create a new vector2 now, and connect the vector2 to the UV and the multiply to the X of the vector2. So this will move our palette color along depending on the grayscale value. Then all we have to do is reconnect these colors back together. So we're going to go from red to a combine. That should be red to red, green to green, blue to blue, and then we want to grab the alpha from the original input texture and then put that. Let me just fix these up. I really like my graphs perfectly aligned, and then that will just go into the color. Alright, and there you have it. So we've set that to a quad. I've just set it to a sprite map for now, but you can save that asset, go back into Unity, create a new folder, and this is where I'm going to store all my palettes, and I'm also going to create a folder for materials. Inside the materials folder, create a new material, name it whatever you want, and then we want to change the shader to the shader that we just created in there under shader graphs. So it's got a preset sprite, but set that to null. because it's going to be using the sprite on the render texture anyway, on the sprite render anyway. And then in our palettes, I usually grab my palettes from LowSpec. They have heaps of great palettes you can just look through. And to create a palette, I'm just going to open up Paint, set my width to how many colors I want, and the height to 1. And then zoom all the way in, and then just copy across the colors into the palette like so. Import that back into Unity. Then we want to set the filter mode to point. So down the bottom here, filter mode point. And then if you get this warning, all you have to do is set the compression to none and hit apply. Then back on the material, set the palette, and you'll see that it's a nice few colors there, even though the image itself is really small. Go ahead and create a new sprite, and then set the sprite to whatever you want to add the palette to, and then change the sprite material. Usually it's set to the default, but if we change it to the sprite palette, then you'll see that we're able to add the palette to that. If we go back to materials now, this sprite adjustment is kind of like a brightness for the palette itself, so you can adjust that a bit and get it to a spot where you like it. I usually leave it around 0.95. I feel like it gives you the best range of colors. And then the sprite itself is grabbing from the sprite renderer, so you don't need to set that at all. Now another thing is, every time you create a new sprite, it's going to have that default material on it. So as you see, it will come up black, or whatever material you have it set to. So to set it to the default, we're going to go to our renderer 2D, then underneath custom material type, change it from lit to custom, and then put in our shader graph material. So now every time we create a new sprite, and we give it a sprite, it should come up with a new texture. So that just saves you a bit of time. And then swapping over the palette is as easy as importing a new texture, setting it to point, and then changing the texture on the material from one palette to another. There you go, you got 2 different palettes, and obviously you can add as many as you want, and you're also able to change it via script by accessing the exposed variable in the shader. Alright, and that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Here's a look at some of the palettes that I've created, and all the code as well as the package is up on GitHub if you want to go and grab that.